Yesterday and Friday, in this very spot, in this very room, there were about 1,100 fourth and fifth graders worshiping, learning more about what it means to follow Jesus. I mean, it was such an incredible atmosphere. It was so cool. And but all that to say too, that if you happen to step in something a little sticky, that's why. It's not because we didn't clean, it's just because there were a lot of kids in here, or maybe a whiff of something unpleasant, or maybe you hear the echo of the screams of a fourth grade boy. That's what that is. Speaking of the screams of a fourth grade boy, we're in week 2 of our series, Meltdown. And when I think of the word meltdown, I think of just falling apart. And maybe you've reached the end of your rope, your capacity, and just can't keep it together any longer. Lots of emotions can manifest from melting down. Maybe for you, a meltdown might look like anger or bitterness or rage. Maybe it's extreme sadness, despair, or even depression. Maybe you're an internalizer and you simply shut down to the world around you. It could be that you medicate to numb the pain or rebel to get attention. Maybe you get lost in some vice that takes your mind off the realities of life. Today in part 2, we're gonna be taking a look at someone that experienced some great losses in her life that led to some bitter grief. The truth is, we all grieve differently. One definition of grief is the normal but bewildering cluster of ordinary human emotions arising in response to a significant loss, and intensified and complicated by the relationship to the person or object lost. You know, sometimes we put a point level on how we should grieve, like the death of a loved one is 10 points, but Starbucks running out of caramel flavoring is 1 point. Some people may grieve a death at level 1, and some people may grieve the Starbucks thing at level 10. Or maybe in honor of the Super Bowl, your football team losing at a level 10, like some of these Cowboy fans from a couple of weeks ago. Just feel for them, right? Feel for them. Nokomis is in here with his cowboy jersey on, and if we would have let this, he's proud. If we would have let this video play out a little longer, you would have saw a clip of him burning his office down. I mean, he just burned it down to the ground. It's just rubble. But we all grieve differently. And for different things. And you know, for so long, I would minimize my grief and loss, because in the back of my mind, I knew that so many other people had lost so much more, so I shouldn't grieve as much. What do I have to grieve about? Sometimes I treated grief as not being grateful for what I actually do have. And the reality is, some people do experience deeper losses in life than others. But the reality also is grief. And everyone experiences losses of some kind, and it's just part of life's journey. And like all life journeys, they seldom go as exactly mapped out or routed. You know, my kids' generation, they're never gonna know the pain of not having a GPS in your hand at all times or in your pocket. I remember pre-internet days when you had to go somewhere that you didn't know how to get there, and you had to have someone give you turn-by-turn directions, and actually had to write it out on a piece of paper, and they would say like turn right on Chestnut and then turn left on Lincoln. You're like, how far is Lincoln? How far am I going? They're like, I don't know, just when you see the sign, turn left. You're like, I mean, is that a mile? Is that a couple states away? I don't know. Then the internet came along, and you could punch in the address on MapQuest.com. God bless MapQuest. I loved it. It was when I was starting to learn how to drive, and I could print out the directions and then follow those to my destination. But the problem would arise when a road was closed, because there's no recalculating happening on a 3-page printed out map, right? So if a road was closed, you just had to figure it out or drive back home and retype it all back in, print it back out again. That's why I think the the detour sign has to be one of the more despised signs and frustrating things about going somewhere. Let's be honest, when you see this sign, there's nothing positive that comes into your mind. It's all negative. If it was supposed to be positive, it'd probably be a different color, like green or something. You don't see it and you go, yes, a detour, that's the sign I was looking for. The detour is what is preventing you from getting to your destination in the most convenient and efficient way. What does it also do? It takes the control out of your hands. You wanted to travel this road to get to your certain destination, and now you can't do that. Now you're inconvenienced. Now you have to be less efficient. Now you may even be late because you can no longer travel the way you want to. You're at the mercy of the situation, and the detour is now in control of your journey. Now it could be a 3-minute 1-block detour. It could be a 10-minute 5-mile detour. But regardless of what it is, you have to go through it. You know, sometimes we think we're smarter than the detour, right? Like, I can't tell you how many times I approach a detour sign and I think, I'll show you a detour. Basically, you're not controlling me, Mr. Detour sign. I'm still in control, so I'll go the opposite way and find a better way. Is it better? Nope. Did it take longer? Absolutely. But I was still in control of my route, right? Doesn't matter to me that the road people know the best detour route. My frustration about the detour overrides that. And I'll go ahead and take matters into my own hands. Now, a lot of times it's like that in our life journey as well. You see, we all have a life journey mapped out. We've calculated it, and we know what the best route is, or at least we think we do. Some of us, we want the quickest route to success. Some of us want the most scenic route in order to take life in. Some of us just want to avoid toll roads. I don't know what the metaphor for that is, but I guess it just means we're cheap. The point is, from a young age, we map out our lives and we determine the best route to take. But there's one thing that we don't plan for, and that's the detour that inevitably happens. You see, in the Bible, we see many people encountering detours in their life, and these detours are often indicative of losses of every kind. Many of the people in the Bible, they experienced deep losses. Now, Naomi was one of those people. Naomi's story is found in the book of Ruth, which we're going to be in today, and she is someone that faced a series of devastating losses, leading her into a deep and bitter grief. Now, the entire book of Ruth is only 4 chapters, but it only takes 5 verses to outline the losses that Naomi would experience. We start in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. It says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. Now, they were from Bethlehem, but went to Moab to live there. And now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband." You see, in just the first 5 verses, we learn that Naomi was married, had 2 sons, was living in her home in Bethlehem, which was a land of famine. So her family packed up, they traveled to Moab, where there was food to live there. And this was about a 7 to 10 day trip. And Naomi's husband dies in Moab. Her sons marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth, and then her sons end up dying roughly 10 years after her husband. See, there's a lot of loss here for Naomi. Her home, her husband, her sons. And the remainder of chapter 1 sets the stage for what is to come. Naomi heard that it was safe to go back to Bethlehem, so she sets out with her 2 daughters-in-law, but then she told them, we read in chapter 1, verse 8, she says to them, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you because the Lord's hand has turned against me. At this, they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. And then when they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Naomi said, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Yeah, so you see Naomi and Ruth, they travel back to Naomi's home of Bethlehem, and they vow to care for each other in their losses. And we learn just how much Naomi is grieving when she even tells people to call her Mara, which is the word for bitter. She says things like, the Lord's hand is turned against me. My life is bitter. The Lord has brought me back empty and afflicted me. There's misfortune upon me. We see there's a lot of grief there, and we can understand that. We can understand that by what she's gone through. To be living in a foreign land, forced out of your home due to famine, and losing your husband, losing your sons, there's a lot to grieve. And Naomi's story may not be all that different than yours. Maybe you've lost people close to you, or maybe you've lost something else. But the truth is this, that we are not meant to go through life without grief. Whether it's sickness or death or the loss of a job and opportunity. Maybe it's simply life not scripted the way you thought it'd be. Maybe you thought you'd be married by now or still married, or that your marriage would be different. You thought your family would support you differently, or your kids would make different choices. You thought your friends would be more friendly than they are. You thought work would be more fulfilling. Maybe it's God. Maybe you blame God for the plights in your life. You wouldn't be the only one. Just crack open the Bible and read about other people that blame God. There's so much lament in the Bible. In fact, there's a book called Lamentations. And it's a book of the Bible that is all about God's people expressing their grief to God. It documents the resulting peril of the Israelites falling to Babylon and the destruction of Jerusalem. And the book of Lamentations, it's a series of 5 poems that are intricately woven together, and it's considered a literary masterpiece. Themes are evident that trouble has come, there's Jerusalem's destruction, grief is expressed, and restoration is prayed for. In fact, in Lamentations, we see that God's people are not asked to deny their emotions, but rather voice their protest, vent their feelings, to pour it all out. Just read a little bit from Lamentations chapter 3, starting in verse 19. It says, I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. Basically, God, I remember my pain, the bitterness of it, yet your compassion never fails. Your mercies never end. You are enough, and therefore I will wait. I will wait for restoration. And while I wait, I will grieve. And the longer I wait, the more I will grieve. And the more my soul will grow in the likeness of God. Because it's in this waiting that I will rely more and more on you. It's in the waiting that I will press more and more into you. What this lament reminds us is that God is not just a God of glory, but he's also a son of suffering. Nicholas Wolsterstorff, in his writing Lament for a Son, he records his reflections and struggles following the death of his 25-year-old son in a mountain climbing accident. He doesn't have any explanations or answers for why God would have allowed such a tragedy. Who would, right? But he writes, through the prism of my tears, I've seen a suffering God. It is said of God that no one can behold his face and live, and I always thought this meant that no one could see his splendor and live. A friend said perhaps this meant that no one could see his sorrow and live. Or perhaps his sorrow is splendor. Here's the truth. Jesus says it in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:4. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Sometimes we don't feel like we can grieve to God because we don't want to insult God or make him think that we're not grateful for our lives. And we treat him often like a boss at work. We grumble under our breath or complain to others, but in his presence we praise and worship him. We can't let him think we're ungrateful or disgruntled. But the truth is God welcomes it. Read through some of David's Psalms. David was so sure of God's acceptance of him that he was willing to bare his soul before him. There's nothing you can express to God that will lead him to reject you. He's not going to fire you for being disgruntled. On the contrary, he will sit down and he will grieve with you because the God of glory is also the son of suffering. My point is this: we all experience grief, although we all hope not to, but that's just unrealistic. Show me a person that has lived their life with no grief or pain or suffering. Show me that person so we can make a movie about them. Except that movie would flop because we all need a movie where the main character experiences grief, right? Why? Because that's life and we want to see a story with grief so we can see a story of redemption. Now, there are different degrees of grief we may experience or different degrees of loss, but no one is immune to it and no one can escape it. I love how one person said it: the presence of grief does not demonstrate weakness, but rather it demonstrates that love, affection, or belonging has been felt. The capacity of love to love and be loved is inherent in the design of God. And when we love and value people or things, losing them just brings sadness. The reality is, with the word, God could remove all pain and suffering. There's nothing he cannot do, which begs the question sometimes, why doesn't he always remove it as quickly as possible? Why not take the detour sign down? Why not fix the road quickly? Just take it away. It's a nuisance. It's a hindrance in my life. It's a speed bump. It's a roadblock to where I really want to go. It's hindering my spiritual formation, my growth in Jesus. I believe the reason he doesn't always remove it is because there are times when the detour does more than get you to where you need to go. There are times that the detour shows you things you've never seen before. There are times that the detour opens up your understanding of the journey that you are on. And while detours can be a disruption and sometimes even feel devastating, they can also reveal new routes on your journey that may lead to new revelations, a deeper understanding of who God is. See, Naomi experienced some detours in her life, and from leaving her home to unexpected deaths of the family to returning home with not her husband and 2 sons, but 1 daughter-in-law. Not the journey she had mapped out, yet nevertheless the journey she was on. And in Ruth chapter 2, we're introduced to a man named Boaz. And Boaz was a family member of Naomi's late husband. He was what was called a kinsman redeemer. And we read in Leviticus 25 what a kinsman redeemer does. It's a relative who could redeem what was lost. This could be property, freedom, or even a name. The kinsman redeemer was essentially a rescuer and restorer. And there were a few things that a kinsman redeemer had to check off the boxes. Number 1, this person had to be kin or from the same family. They had to be a relative. 2, they had to be willing to redeem. They had to be okay with doing that. Number 3, they had to have the means to redeem. They had to be qualified for it. And number 4, they had to pay the price in full. That's what kinsman redeemer had to do. And Boaz, he checked all the boxes. And we find out that someone actually closer relative than Boaz was more qualified. And so Boaz, he brought this other kinsman up to speed. And this other kinsman says in chapter 4, verse 4, I will redeem it. Then Boaz lays out what happens when he would redeem it. He says in verse 5, basically, that's great that you're willing to redeem it, but here's all the baggage that comes with it. And we read on, it says, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. At this, the guardian redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. So Boaz, you redeem it yourself because I cannot do it. You see, he was a relative, he had the means, but he wasn't willing to do it. He didn't want to take on the debt. So Boaz did, and Boaz married Ruth, and they had a son. And we read in verse 14 of chapter 4 that the women said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life, sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. And the women living there said, Naomi has a son. And they named him Obed. And Obed was the father of Jesse. And Jesse was the father of David. And as we know, that was the family lineage that would later bring into the world the Savior, the Messiah, Jesus. You see, pain and sorrows are the detours of life. Grieving is part of the journey, but the detour doesn't always have to take us down dark roads with potholes. God can use the detour to show you a new journey, to open your eyes to things you've never seen before. It can ultimately open up your understanding of the journey that you are on. And it can open up wider your own view of who God is and how he's working in your life. And all this can lead to a larger soul for compassion and empathy towards others. Maybe it's the detour that takes you to a more direct path to the cross than you were on. You know, nobody wants a detour, but detours are a part of life. And instead of knocking down barriers to stay on the road you want to be on or you think you were destined to be on, follow the leading, allow the grieving, and ask God to show you things on this new journey you need to see. Maybe it's not about removing the grief from our lives, but rather redeeming it in our lives. See, the story of Naomi wasn't about God fixing the things in her life that brought her grief. Nothing was going to bring back her husband and sons, and nothing could repair that depth of loss in her life. But even though her pain and grief would not be removed, it would be redeemed, and her name would be restored. And sometimes we just need to understand that grief is not a detour we need to avoid, but rather it may be a new journey we need to take. We can get so caught up on the word detour that we miss the arrow below. And it may be the arrow pointing us to something that we need to see. I love how pastor and author of Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, Pete Scazzaro, puts it. He says, when we go to God in our grief, asking him to redeem it as opposed to removing it, our souls can actually enlarge it. Basically, our empathy, our care, our compassion can actually grow in and through our grief. We can look at our grief, our pain and suffering as a bridge to someone else's pain and suffering. Naomi was able to love and care for and empathize with Ruth. And Ruth was able to love and care for and empathize with Naomi. Why? Because they had both experienced a loss. And they both had to grieve that loss. I love what Jerry Sitzer says. He says, catastrophic loss, by definition, it precludes recovery. It will transform us or it will destroy us. But it will never leave us the same. There's no going back to the past. It's not therefore true that we become less through loss unless we allow the loss to make us less, grinding our soul down until there's nothing left. But loss, he says, can actually also make us more. He says, I did not get over the loss of my loved ones. Rather, I absorbed the loss into my life until it became part of who I am. Sorrow took up permanent residence in my soul and enlarged it. He says, one learns the pain of others by suffering one's own pain, by turning inside oneself, by finding one's own soul. However painful, sorrow is good for the soul, and the soul is elastic like a balloon, and it can grow larger through suffering. See, we cannot be the followers of Jesus that we are called to be without walking through grief. It's unavoidable, and we shouldn't avoid it. And grieving is what stretches our faith to new levels. I love what John Mark Comer actually points out, that there are 3 things that lead to a deeper work of spiritual formation. The first 2 are easy to understand. 1, he says contemplative prayer, where we are practicing being in the presence of God throughout our day. 2, he says deep community, which requires inviting people into our lives as we share in theirs. And number 3, is suffering. He says contemplative prayer, deep community, and suffering. You're probably not going to see that on any church vision statement, right? 2 of those which we do on purpose, 1 which is done to us. Without pain and suffering in life, we have only skimmed the surface of our faith. We are only experiencing the tip of the iceberg. And that's why pain and suffering are not interruptions in our faith, but can be catalysts of our faith. You see, when we treat grief as an unwelcome emotion, dealing with an unwelcome interruption of pain, then all grief becomes to us are speed bumps in our faith journey, more roadblocks in our spiritual formation. But when we lean into our pain and we're okay to grieve in our season of loss, then what we do is we open the door for God to reveal himself in ways that we never thought possible. That these pain roadblocks lead to remarkable detours that we never planned, that may take us out of our way, but reveal things we'd otherwise never see. What would it look like if our prayers moved from, God, remove my grief, to God, help me to experience the depth of your love in the depth of my grief? You know, we all go through seasons of life. We're aware of that. It's part of it. There's even a popular passage in the Bible that talks through this in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Spells it out, says this: there is a time for everything, a season for every activity under the heavens. There's a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to uproot. There's a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build. There's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away. There's a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. You know, if you think of life like actual seasons, there's a season of summer, which is kind of like abundance. There's seasons of winter, which is kind of like death. Seasons of fall, which are like transitions in life. And there's the seasons of spring, which is like rebirth and new life. And I love what Parker Palmer says, that autumn is a season, he explains autumn as a season of great beauty. But he says it's also a season of decline. The days grow shorter, the light is suffused, and summer's abundance decays towards winter's death. And he says, in my own experience of autumn, I'm rarely aware that seeds are being planted. He goes on to say, but as I explore autumn's paradox of dying and seeding, I feel the power of this metaphor. In the autumnal events of my own experience, I'm easily fixated on these surface appearances, like the decline of meaning, the decay of a relationship, the death of a work. And yet, if I look more deeply, I may see the myriad of possibilities being planted to bear fruit in some season yet to come. In retrospect, I can see in my own life what I could not see at the time. How the job I lost helped me find the work I needed to do. How the road closed sign turned me toward terrain I needed to travel. How losses that felt irredeemable forced me to discern meanings I needed to know. On the surface, it seemed that life was lessening, but silently and lavishly, the seeds of new life are always being sown. I want to just end with 5 prayers to pray while grieving. And these are going to pop up pretty fast, and don't feel like you have to write them down or memorize them. They're in the app as well with a lot of resources on grief. And so we encourage you to check these out. But here's some prayers to pray while grieving. One is this: Jesus, thank you for being my Redeemer. Redeem my grief rather than remove it. God, as I wait for restoration, guide me to notice the journey and the detour. God, help me to experience the depths of your love in the depths of my grief. Jesus, remind me that you are not just the God of glory, but you are also the Son of suffering. And Jesus, show me how I can empathize and care for my own grief with others who are grieving.